when Staff Sergeant Derek Vance decided to humiliate what he called the smallest nurse in the hospital. He had no idea he was about to face a decorated Navy SEAL medic who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan. What happened next would end his military career and change everything at Riverside Medical Center forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Riley Cameron, and at 5 feet 2 and 115 pounds, I've spent my entire nursing career proving that size doesn't determine strength. For the past 12 years, I've worked in emergency medicine, with the last 5 as the head trauma nurse at Riverside Medical Center in Cedar Falls, just outside Camp Harrison Marine Base in North Carolina. Most people see a petite woman with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing scrubs that seem too big for my frame. They see someone who looks like she should be working in pediatrics or maybe the quiet medical floors, not in the chaos of a level 1 trauma center, where we regularly treat everything from car accidents to combat injuries from the nearby base. What they don't see is the 8 years I served as a Navy hospital corpsman before becoming a nurse. They don't see the 3 deployments to Afghanistan where I earned a Bronze Star for Valor after treating wounded Marines under enemy fire. They don't see the countless hours of tactical medical training, the advanced combat lifesaver certifications, or the hand-to-hand combat skills that kept me alive. When our forward operating base was overrun in Helmand Province, I deliberately don't talk about my military service at work. It's not out of modesty, it's strategic. In my experience, when people underestimate you, they reveal their true character much faster. The respectful patients and colleagues treat me well regardless of what they assume about my background. The problematic ones show their true colors immediately, which makes it easier to handle them appropriately. Riverside Medical Center serves both civilian and military populations, which means we see a constant stream of active duty personnel. From Camp Harrison, most are professional and respectful, understanding that military rank doesn't apply in our civilian hospital. They follow our protocols, treat our staff with courtesy, and focus on getting the medical care they need. But there's always that 1%, the ones who think their uniform gives them authority over everyone around them, regardless of the setting. The ones who mistake respect for fear and confuse compliance with weakness. These are the dangerous ones, not because of their military training, but because they've forgotten the honor that training was supposed to instill. I built my reputation at Riverside through competence and consistency. When the ambulances arrive with multiple trauma victims, I'm the one coordinating triage and ensuring everyone gets the care they need. When we have a combative patient threatening staff, I'm usually the one who can de-escalate the situation without security having to get physical. When new nurses start in our department, they quickly learn that despite my size, I'm someone they can count on when things get difficult. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, our emergency department director, once told me that I have what she calls quiet authority, the ability to command respect through competence rather than intimidation. It served me well in both my military and civilian careers. My team at Riverside includes some of the best medical professionals I've ever worked with. There's Jake Morrison, a former Army medic who transitioned to nursing after his service. Dr. Amanda Torres, a trauma surgeon who came to us from Johns Hopkins. And Teresa Walsh, a veteran nurse with 25 years of experience who's seen everything the emergency department can throw at her. We work together like a well-oiled machine, each of us knowing our role and trusting the others to do theirs. The emergency department at Riverside is a high-stress environment where split-second decisions can mean the difference between life and death. We handle everything from routine medical emergencies to mass casualty events when training exercises at Camp Harrison go wrong. The work is demanding, both physically and emotionally, but it's also incredibly rewarding when you can save someone's life or ease their suffering during their worst moments. What makes our department special isn't just our medical expertise. It's our commitment to treating every patient with dignity and respect, regardless of their background, attitude, or behavior. We've all dealt with difficult patients, from civilians upset about wait times to military personnel who think their rank entitles them to special treatment. Our approach has always been professional de-escalation, clear communication, and when necessary, appropriate security measures. I've always believed that healthcare is fundamentally about service, using your skills and knowledge to help others when they're at their most vulnerable. It doesn't matter if you're treating a general or a private, a CEO, or someone who's homeless. Everyone deserves competent, compassionate care. This philosophy has served me well throughout my career, but it would soon be put to the ultimate test. Because sometimes, no matter how professional you are, how competent your care, or how respectful your approach, you encounter someone who mistakes your restraint for weakness and your compassion for vulnerability. Sometimes, the quiet authority that works so well in normal circumstances isn't enough. Sometimes people push and push until they force you to remind them exactly who they're dealing with. And sometimes, that reminder comes in a way they never expected from someone they never should have underestimated. What I didn't know that Tuesday morning in March was that all my years of training, both medical and military, were about to be put to use in a way I never anticipated in a civilian hospital. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Life at Riverside Medical Center had never been more demanding, but it had also never been more rewarding. Our emergency department was in the middle of a critical expansion phase, having just received a $2.3 million federal grant to upgrade our trauma capabilities and serve as the primary civilian backup for Camp Harrison's medical facilities. The grant came with significant responsibilities. We were required to maintain specific staffing levels, response times, and patient satisfaction scores. More importantly, we had to demonstrate our ability to handle large-scale emergencies and mass casualty events that could overflow from the base. The contract was renewable every 3 years, but only if we met strict performance metrics. This wasn't just about money, though the funding was crucial for our operations. It was about proving that a civilian hospital could seamlessly integrate with military medical protocols while maintaining our own standards of care. The success of this program would determine whether similar partnerships were established at other medical centers across the country. As head trauma nurse, I was directly responsible for coordinating with Camp Harrison's medical staff, ensuring our protocols aligned with military standards without compromising our civilian care model. It was a delicate balance that required constant communication, training, and adjustment. The pressure was immense. Dr. Hendricks had made it clear that any significant incidents involving military personnel could jeopardize the entire contract. We couldn't afford complaints about discrimination, inadequate care, or unprofessional conduct. Every interaction with base personnel was scrutinized, documented, and evaluated. Our department had invested heavily in this partnership. We'd hired additional staff, including Jake Morrison specifically because of his military medical background. We'd purchased new equipment designed to handle combat-related trauma. We'd even renovated our facilities to include a dedicated military liaison office and specialized treatment areas. The financial stakes were higher than most people realized. Losing the contract wouldn't just mean losing the federal funding, it could mean losing our Level 1 trauma designation entirely. Other hospitals in the region were already positioning themselves to take over if we failed. Cedar Falls General, our biggest competitor, had been publicly questioning whether our facility was large enough to handle the responsibility. Beyond the institutional pressure, there were personal stakes for everyone on our team. Jake had moved his family from Virginia specifically for this position. Dr. Torres had turned down a prestigious fellowship to help build our program. Teresa had postponed her retirement to see the project through its first cycle. For me, the stakes were particularly high. I'd been the one to propose the partnership in the first place, drawing on my military experience to convince the hospital board that we could make it work. My reputation was tied to its success. If the program failed, it wouldn't just affect my career at Riverside. It would likely end my prospects of advancing in emergency medicine anywhere. The community was watching too. Cedar Falls had always been proud of its relationship with Camp Harrison, but there had been growing tensions in recent years. Some local businesses felt that military personnel received preferential treatment, while some base personnel felt unwelcome in town. Our medical partnership was seen as a symbol of cooperation that could bridge those divides. Local media had covered the grant announcement extensively, with several articles highlighting my role as a veteran, helping to facilitate military-civilian cooperation. The mayor had even mentioned our program in his State of the City address, calling it a model for military community integration that other cities should emulate. But success brought scrutiny from unexpected directions. Some of the long-term staff at Riverside resented the additional protocols and documentation required for military patients. They complained about the extra training sessions, the modified procedures, and what they saw as special treatment for base personnel. There were also challenges from the military side. While most Camp Harrison personnel were professional and respectful, there was a vocal minority who questioned whether civilian medical staff could provide adequate care for military injuries. Some had openly expressed preference for being treated at the base clinic, even for serious emergencies that required our trauma capabilities. The pressure was affecting everyone differently. Jake had become almost obsessively focused on proving that former military personnel could successfully transition to civilian healthcare. Dr. Torres was working longer hours than ever, determined to demonstrate that our trauma outcomes met or exceeded military medical standards. Teresa was documenting everything meticulously, knowing that any complaint could trigger a review of the entire program. I found myself walking the constant tightrope. I had to be professional enough to maintain civilian healthcare standards, but knowledgeable enough about military culture to communicate effectively with base personnel. I had to be authoritative enough to maintain order in emergency situations, but diplomatic enough to avoid any perception of power struggles with military patients. The most challenging aspect was maintaining the balance between my civilian nursing role and my military background. Some situations required me to draw on my combat medical training, while others demanded that I completely set aside my military experience to focus on civilian protocols. Knowing when to reference my service and when to keep it private had become an art form. What made everything more complicated was the unspoken expectation that I would serve as an unofficial liaison between the hospital and the base. Dr. Hendricks regularly asked for my input on military-related policies. Base personnel often sought me out for clarification on hospital procedures. I was caught between two worlds, representing each to the other while trying to maintain my primary focus on patient care. The success we'd achieved so far had come at a significant personal cost. I was working 60-hour weeks, attending constant meetings, and dealing with stress levels that reminded me more of combat deployments than civilian nursing. But I believed in what we were building, and I was determined to see it succeed. What I didn't realize was how fragile that success really was, and how quickly everything we'd built could be threatened by a single person who viewed respect as a weakness and authority as something to be challenged rather than earned. It was 2:30 p.m. on a Tuesday when Staff Sergeant Derek Vance walked into our emergency department, and I knew immediately we were going to have problems. Not because of his medical condition. He was walking under his own power with what appeared to be a minor hand injury, but because of the way he carried himself and the way he looked at our staff. Vance was an imposing figure, about 6'3", with the kind of build that came from years of military fitness training. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, and his expression suggested he was deeply annoyed about having to be in a civilian hospital at all. What caught my attention immediately was how his eyes swept the triage area, not with the typical nervousness of someone seeking medical care, but with the calculating assessment of someone evaluating targets. Teresa was working triage that afternoon, and I watched from the nurse's station as Vance approached her desk. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the dismissive way he looked at her, as if her 25 years of nursing experience meant nothing because she was a middle-aged civilian. "Woman, I need to see a doctor immediately," he announced, loud enough for half the waiting room to hear. "I'm Staff Sergeant Vance from Camp Harrison, and I don't have time to wait around with these people." Teresa, professional as always, began her standard triage assessment. "I understand, Sergeant. Can you tell me what happened to your hand?" "That's Staff Sergeant," he corrected sharply. "And what happened is military business. I just need it looked at so I can get back to work." I could see Teresa's patient smile tighten slightly, but she continued with her questions. That's when Vance made his first mistake. He started looking around the department with obvious contempt, making comments just loud enough for staff and patients to hear. "Typical civilian operation," he muttered as Teresa documented his vital signs. "No sense of urgency, no understanding of priorities. Back on base, medical personnel know how to show proper respect to NCOs." A few patients in the waiting area shifted uncomfortably. Our department served military families regularly, and they knew this wasn't how professional military personnel typically behaved. But Vance was just getting started. When Teresa explained that he'd need to wait to be called back, like all non-emergency patients, Vance's voice rose again. "Do you people not understand how military contracts work? This hospital depends on Camp Harrison for funding. I could make one phone call and change your entire budget." That's when I decided to intervene. As head trauma nurse, part of my job was protecting my staff from abusive patients and maintaining order in the department. I approached the triage desk with my most professional demeanor. "Good afternoon, Staff Sergeant. I'm Riley Cameron, the head trauma nurse. Is there something I can help clarify about our procedures?" Vance turned to look at me, and I saw his expression shift from annoyance to something that looked almost amused. His eyes took in my small frame, my youthful appearance, and what he probably saw as my non-threatening demeanor. I watched him mentally dismiss me as irrelevant before he even spoke. "Yeah, you can explain why a simple hand injury requires me to sit in a waiting room for 2 hours with civilians when I have important military duties to attend to." "I understand your time is valuable," I replied calmly. "Our triage system prioritizes patients based on medical need rather than occupation. If you're experiencing severe pain or if there are signs of serious injury, we can reassess your priority level." Vance laughed, actually laughed, as if I'd said something ridiculous. "Medical need? Do you have any idea what military readiness means? I have Marines depending on me. My duties are more important than whatever minor complaints these people have." He gestured dismissively toward the waiting room, which included an elderly man with chest pain waiting for test results, a mother with a sick infant, and a construction worker with a potentially broken arm. The contempt in his voice was unmistakable. "I'm sure your duties are important," I said, maintaining my calm tone. "But our medical protocols don't differentiate based on occupation. Everyone receives care based on the severity of their condition." That's when Vance made his second mistake. He stepped closer to me, using his height to try to intimidate me, and lowered his voice in what he probably thought was a menacing manner. "Listen, little nurse, I don't think you understand how things work around here. This hospital has a contract with Camp Harrison. That contract can be renewed or terminated based on how well you people serve military personnel. Now, I suggest you find me a doctor before I have to explain to my commanding officer why civilian medical staff don't understand the concept of military priority. The little nurse comment hung in the air like a challenge. I could see Teresa's eyes widen slightly, and I noticed that Jake had moved closer to the triage area, probably sensing the tension. Several patients in the waiting room were now openly staring at our interaction. What Vance didn't realize was that his attempt at intimidation had just revealed everything I needed to know about his character. He was a bully who used his rank and size to push around people he perceived as weak. He had no respect for civilian authority or medical protocols. Most importantly, he was the kind of person who would escalate a situation rather than accept reasonable explanations. I also realized that this was exactly the type of incident Dr. Hendricks had warned us about. Any complaint from military personnel could jeopardize our contract, but so could the appearance that we were giving preferential treatment based on military status rather than medical need. I understand your concerns about the contract, I said, still maintaining my professional tone. However, our protocols are actually part of what the contract requires: equal treatment based on medical standards, not military rank. Would you like me to call our military liaison to explain our triage procedures? I told you that I won't commit medical fraud, I replied calmly. You'll receive the same high-quality care that every patient receives here, prioritized according to medical need and following proper documentation procedures. I could see Teresa nodding slightly from behind the triage desk, and Jake had moved close enough to provide backup if needed. But I also noticed some of the other staff members looking worried, probably thinking about their jobs and the contract that funded their positions. Vance took a step closer, clearly trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. Let me explain something to you about how the real world works, he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a menacing tone. This hospital depends on military contracts to survive. Those contracts exist because people like me recommend them to people like Colonel Mills. He gestured around the emergency department with obvious contempt. You think this place would last 6 months without military funding? You think your job would exist if people like me didn't speak favorably about civilian medical capabilities? Our contract exists because we provide excellent medical care according to established standards, I replied. It doesn't exist because we give preferential treatment or falsify records for military personnel who demand special consideration. That's when Vance made what would turn out to be a crucial mistake. Instead of backing down or trying a different approach, he decided to escalate further and make his threat more explicit. You clearly don't understand what's at stake here, he said, pulling out his phone again. I'm going to make this very simple for you. Either you personally take me back right now and get me seen immediately with appropriate documentation showing military priority, or I make the phone call that ends this little partnership experiment. He held up his phone like a weapon. One call to Colonel Mills explaining how I was discriminated against by civilian staff who refused to recognize military operational requirements. One call describing how the head nurse was hostile and unprofessional. When I explained the urgency of my situation, the waiting room had gone completely silent again. I could see patients looking back and forth between us like they were watching a tennis match, sensing that something significant was happening but not fully understanding what. And just so we're clear, Vance continued, his voice getting louder, when I make that call, I won't just be reporting on today's incident. I'll be recommending a full review of civilian staff competency, questioning whether this hospital has the military understanding necessary to maintain its contract, and suggesting that maybe Camp Harrison needs to find a more cooperative medical partner. He leaned forward slightly, clearly thinking he was delivering the knockout blow. Your choice, little nurse. Play ball with the people who pay your salary, or find out what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, staff members worried about their jobs, patients wondering if their care would be affected, and Vance smugly confident that he'd finally applied enough pressure to get what he wanted. What he didn't understand was that his threats had actually made my decision easier, not harder. By making it explicit that he wanted me to commit fraud and by threatening our entire program, he'd removed any ambiguity about what kind of person I was dealing with. "I told you that I won't commit medical fraud," I replied calmly. "You'll receive the same high-quality care that every patient receives here, prioritized according to medical need and following proper documentation procedures." I could see Teresa nodding slightly from behind the triage desk, and Jake had moved close enough to provide backup if needed. But I also noticed some of the other staff members looking worried, probably thinking about their jobs and the contract that funded their positions. Vance took a step closer, clearly trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. "Let me explain something to you about how the real world works," he said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a menacing tone. "This hospital depends on military contracts to survive. Those contracts exist because people like me recommend them to people like Colonel Mills." He gestured around the emergency department with obvious contempt. "You think this place would last 6 months without military funding? You think your job would exist if people like me didn't speak favorably about civilian medical capabilities? Our contract exists because we provide excellent medical care according to established standards," I replied. "It doesn't exist because we give preferential treatment or falsify records for military personnel who demand special consideration." That's when Vance made what would turn out to be a crucial mistake. Instead of backing down or trying a different approach, he decided to escalate further and make his threat more explicit. "You clearly don't understand what's at stake here," he said, pulling out his phone again. "I'm going to make this very simple for you. Either you personally take me back right now and get me seen immediately with appropriate documentation showing military priority, or I make the phone call that ends this little partnership experiment." He held up his phone like a weapon. One call to Colonel Mills explaining how I was discriminated against by civilian staff who refused to recognize military operational requirements. One call describing how the head nurse was hostile and unprofessional. When I explained the urgency of my situation, the waiting room had gone completely silent again. I could see patients looking back and forth between us like they were watching a tennis match, sensing that something significant was happening but not fully understanding what. "And just so we're clear," Vance continued, his voice getting louder, "when I make that call, I won't just be reporting on today's incident. I'll be recommending a full review of civilian staff competency, questioning whether this hospital has the military understanding necessary to maintain its contract, and suggesting that maybe Camp Harrison needs to find a more cooperative medical partner." He leaned forward slightly, clearly thinking he was delivering the knockout blow. "Your choice, little nurse. Play ball with the people who pay your salary, or find out what happens when you bite the hand that feeds you." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, though it was probably only a few seconds. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, staff members worried about their jobs, patients wondering if their care would be affected, and Vance smugly confident that he'd finally applied enough pressure to get what he wanted. What he didn't understand was that his threats had actually made my decision easier, not harder. By making it explicit that he wanted me to commit fraud and by threatening our entire program, he'd removed any ambiguity about what kind of person I was dealing with. "Staff Sergeant," I said, my voice remaining calm despite the adrenaline I could feel coursing through my system. "I need you to understand something very clearly. This hospital and our emergency department operate according to medical ethics, federal healthcare regulations, and professional standards that cannot be compromised regardless of who makes the request." I took a step forward, closing some of the distance he'd been using to try to intimidate me. Your hand injury will be evaluated and treated according to the same protocols we use for every patient. If it's determined to be urgent, you'll be seen immediately. If it's not urgent, you'll wait your turn like everyone else." Vance's face was starting to turn red, but I wasn't finished. "As for your threats about our military contract," I continued, "I'm confident that our program's success is based on providing excellent care according to established standards, not on giving preferential treatment or falsifying records for military personnel who believe their rank entitles them to special consideration." I could see Jake nodding approvingly from the nurse's station, and Teresa was watching with what looked like a mixture of pride and terror. Some of the patients in the waiting room actually looked impressed, though others seemed worried about what this confrontation might mean for their own care. "Furthermore," I said, maintaining eye contact with Vance, "if you choose to make complaints based on our refusal to provide preferential treatment or falsified documentation, I'm confident that a proper investigation will reveal that we acted appropriately and professionally throughout this interaction." Vance's expression had shifted from confident to incredulous to furious during my response. I could see him processing the fact that his intimidation tactics weren't working, that his threats weren't being taken seriously, and that the little nurse he'd thought he could push around was actually standing her ground. "You have no idea what you've just done," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "You have no idea who you're messing with or what kind of consequences this is going to have." "I know exactly what I've done," I replied calmly. "I've upheld the medical and ethical standards that govern this hospital and my profession. If that creates consequences, then we'll deal with them appropriately." The standoff stretched for another few seconds, with Vance clearly trying to decide whether to escalate further or retreat. I could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his options, probably realizing that his usual intimidation tactics weren't going to work on someone. I looked around the department, seeing the worried faces of my colleagues and the uncomfortable expressions of patients who were clearly aware that something significant was happening. Teresa was trying to maintain normal operations, but I could see the stress in her movements. Even some of the military family members in the waiting area looked disturbed by Vance's behavior, whispering among themselves about whether this was appropriate conduct. When I reached Dr. Hendrick's office, she was already on the phone, her expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. She gestured for me to sit while she finished her conversation. "Yes, Colonel Mills, I understand the concern. We take all complaints about staff conduct seriously. Yes, we'll conduct a full investigation immediately. I'll have a preliminary report to you by tomorrow morning." After she hung up, she turned to me with a mixture of frustration and worry. "Riley, I just spent 15 minutes on the phone with the base medical command. They've received formal complaints alleging discrimination, unprofessional conduct, and failure to meet contractual obligations regarding military personnel. Dr. Hendricks, I can explain exactly what happened." She held up her hand. "I'm sure you can, and I'm sure you handled it appropriately. But that's not the immediate problem. The problem is that Staff Sergeant Vance has filed complaints at multiple levels of command, and he's apparently documented everything with photos, recordings, and witness statements." My heart sank as I realized the scope of what Vance had orchestrated. "He recorded our conversation?" "According to Colonel Mills, he has audio recordings of your interaction, photographs of the waiting room showing other patients being seen while he waited, and statements from witnesses about your hostile and discriminatory behavior toward military personnel." Dr. Hendricks leaned back in her chair, looking exhausted. "Riley, the base command is treating this as a potential contract violation. They're sending a review team tomorrow to investigate the incident and evaluate whether our hospital is suitable for continued military partnership." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Not only was my job potentially at risk, but the entire program I'd helped build could be terminated. All the staff we'd hired, all the equipment we'd purchased, all the patients who depended on our hour. Services, everything could be lost because I'd refused to falsify medical records for one entitled bully. There's more, Dr. Hendricks continued grimly. Vance has apparently contacted other military personnel who've been treated here, asking them to review their experiences with our staff. He's specifically asking about instances where they might have felt they didn't receive appropriate priority or respect. I felt sick. He's conducting his own investigation to build a case against us. It gets worse. He's also contacted the local media. Channel 7 received a call about discrimination against military personnel at civilian hospital. They're asking for comments about our military partnership program and whether we're providing adequate care to service members. The systematic nature of Vance's retaliation was becoming clear. This wasn't an angry reaction. It was a calculated campaign designed to destroy both my career and our hospital's military partnership. He was using every tool at his disposal: formal military complaints, media attention, and peer pressure within the military community. Dr. Hendricks, I want you to know that I followed all protocols correctly. I refused to falsify documentation and provide preferential treatment based on rank rather than medical need. I was professional throughout the entire interaction, she nodded. I believe you, Riley. But belief isn't going to matter if the review team concludes that we discriminated against military personnel or failed to meet our contractual obligations. And even if we're cleared of wrongdoing, the damage to our reputation could be irreversible. As if on cue, her phone rang again. After a brief conversation, she looked even more troubled. That was Channel 7. They want to interview someone about allegations that our hospital discriminates against military personnel and fails to understand military culture. I realized that Vance's retaliation was just beginning. He hadn't just made a few phone calls. He'd launched a comprehensive attack, designed to destroy everything we built. And the most frustrating part was that he was doing it all while still sitting in our waiting room, presumably waiting to receive the same high-quality medical care he was, simultaneously claiming we refused to provide. The irony would have been laughable if the consequences weren't so serious. But as I sat in Dr. Hendricks' office, watching our carefully constructed partnership program crumble in real time, I realized that Staff Sergeant Vance had seriously underestimated who he was dealing with. He thought he was destroying the career of a little nurse who didn't understand how the real world worked. What he didn't realize was that he'd just declared war on someone with the training, experience, and determination to fight back. And unlike his intimidation tactics, my response was going to be based on truth, documentation, and the kind of strategic thinking I'd learned in some very dangerous places. The battle was just beginning, and Vance was about to learn that there's a big difference between bullying someone and actually defeating them. The next 48 hours felt like being caught in an avalanche. What had started as a single complaint from Staff Sergeant Vance quickly snowballed into a full-scale crisis that threatened to bury everything we'd worked to build at Riverside Medical Center. By Wednesday morning, the hospital's administrative offices were fielding calls from multiple military commands, local government officials, and media outlets. Dr. Hendricks called an emergency meeting with all department heads to address what she grimly referred to as the Vance situation. The review team from Camp Harrison will be here Friday, she announced to the assembled medical staff. They'll be conducting interviews with all personnel who had contact with Staff Sergeant Vance, reviewing our documentation procedures, and evaluating whether our treatment protocols meet military partnership requirements. I could see the worried glances being exchanged around the conference table. Dr. Martinez from internal medicine spoke up first. Patricia, how serious is this? Are we talking about losing the entire military contract? It's possible, Dr. Hendricks replied bluntly. Colonel Mills made it clear that any evidence of discrimination or failure to meet contractual obligations could result in immediate termination of our partnership agreement. The financial implications hit everyone simultaneously. Jake raised His hand hesitantly. What happens to the staff positions that were created specifically for the military program? Those positions would be eliminated, she said, not sugarcoating the reality. We're looking at potential layoffs for 12 people, including several in the emergency department. I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders like a lead blanket. 12 people could lose their jobs because I'd refused to compromise my professional integrity for one bullying Marine. But the pressure wasn't just coming from within the hospital. By Thursday, Vance's campaign had expanded far beyond official military channels. Teresa pulled me aside during our shift. "Change, Riley, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." Her voice was tight with stress. "My husband got a call yesterday from someone claiming to be conducting a survey about military satisfaction with local healthcare services. My stomach dropped. What kind of questions?" "Very specific ones about our emergency department. Whether military personnel felt they received appropriate priority, whether the nursing staff seemed knowledgeable about military culture, whether there had been any incidents of disrespectful treatment." Vance is conducting his own investigation, I realized. He's trying to build a pattern of complaints. Teresa nodded grimly. "It gets worse. Sarah from registration told me that 3 military families canceled appointments this week. When she asked why, one of them mentioned hearing concerns about our attitude toward service members. The systematic destruction of our reputation was working exactly as Vance had planned. He wasn't just filing complaints through official channels, he was conducting a whisper campaign within the military community to turn public opinion against us. That evening, the local news coverage began. Channel 7's health reporter, David Fletcher, led with a story titled "Military Personnel Alleged Discrimination at Local Hospital." The segment was carefully worded to avoid legal issues, but the implications were clear. Sources within the military community have raised concerns about treatment at Riverside Medical Center, Fletcher reported, standing in front of our hospital's main entrance. Allegations include discrimination based on military status and failure to understand the unique needs of service members. They interviewed Vance, though his identity was obscured and his voice distorted. "Civilian medical staff need to understand that military personnel have different requirements," his altered voice said. "When someone is responsible for the safety and readiness of other Marines, their medical needs take priority. It's not about special treatment, it's about operational necessity." The segment also included comments from Dr. Hendricks defending our hospital's policies, but her measured, professional response seemed weak compared to Vance's emotional appeal about military sacrifice and readiness. What made it worse was the timing. The story aired during the evening news cycle when most of our staff were at home with their families, watching their workplace being portrayed as discriminatory and unprofessional. Jake called me that night, his voice strained. "My daughter saw the news. She asked me if I was going to lose my job because we don't like soldiers. How do I explain this to an 8-year-old? I didn't have a good answer. How do you explain that sometimes doing the right thing comes with a cost that extends far beyond yourself?" Friday morning brought the military review team, and with them, a level of scrutiny I'd never experienced in civilian healthcare. Colonel Patricia Mills arrived with 2 other officers and a civilian contractor who specialized in military-civilian healthcare partnerships. The interviews were thorough and intimidating. Each staff member who'd been present during the Vance incident was questioned separately, their statements recorded and compared for consistency. The reviewers examined our triage protocols, documentation procedures, and training materials with the precision of a military investigation. When my turn came, Colonel Mills got straight to the point. "Nurse Cameron, Staff Sergeant Vance has alleged that you discriminated against him based on his military status and that you were hostile and unprofessional during your interaction. How do you respond to these allegations?" I'd prepared for this moment, but sitting across from 3 military officers while my career hung in the balance, was still intimidating. "Colonel," I treated Staff Sergeant Vance exactly as I would treat any patient presenting with a non-emergency condition. I followed our established triage protocols and maintained professional conduct throughout our interaction. "He claims you refused to provide priority treatment, despite his explanation of military operational requirements." I explained our triage system, which prioritizes patients based on medical need rather than occupation or rank. When he requested that I falsify documentation to show that his minor injury received emergency priority, I refused because that would violate medical ethics and federal healthcare regulations. Colonel Mills' expression remained neutral, but I caught a slight change in her posture. "Staff Sergeant Vance requested that you falsify medical records?" "Yes, ma'am." Specifically, he wanted me to document that his hand injury received emergency priority treatment due to military necessity, when in fact it was a minor condition that could safely wait for routine evaluation. The colonel exchanged glances with her colleagues. "Did you explain this to Staff Sergeant Vance?" "I did. I also offered to have our trauma surgeon perform a quick assessment to determine if his condition warranted higher priority, which he declined." The interview continued for another hour, covering every detail of the incident, our military partnership protocols, and my background as a former Navy corpsman. Throughout it all, I maintained the same position. I had acted professionally and ethically, following established procedures that were designed to provide excellent care while maintaining appropriate priorities. But even as I answered their questions, I could see the doubt in some of their expressions. Vance had been very clever in his allegations, mixing legitimate complaints about wait times with inflammatory claims about discrimination and unprofessional conduct. Even if the review team concluded that his specific allegations were unfounded, the damage to our reputation might be irreversible. As the review team prepared to leave, Colonel Mills pulled me aside. "Nurse Cameron, I want you to know that we'll be conducting a thorough investigation, including interviews with other military personnel who've received care here. We'll have our findings within a week. A week to determine whether everything we'd built would survive. A week for Vance's whisper campaign to continue spreading throughout the military community. A week for 12 people to wonder if they'd still have jobs." That weekend, I sat in my apartment staring at the walls, trying to figure out how to fight back against an enemy who'd turned our own success against us. Vance had weaponized the very military partnership I'd helped create, using our commitment to serving military personnel as evidence of our failure to serve them properly. But as I reviewed everything that had happened, I began to see patterns in Vance's behavior that suggested this wasn't his first rodeo. His tactics were too sophisticated, his approach too systematic for someone who was simply angry about a long wait time. Staff Sergeant Derek Vance was about to learn that he'd picked the wrong target for his campaign of intimidation and destruction. Because while he'd been busy trying to destroy my career, I'd been quietly preparing to fight back with the one weapon he hadn't counted on: the truth. The breaking point came on Monday morning when I arrived at work to find Jake cleaning out his desk. My heart sank as I realized what this meant before he even looked up to explain. "They're letting me go," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "Budget cuts due to uncertainty about the military contract. Dr. Hendricks said they can't afford to keep military-specific positions if the partnership gets terminated." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Jake, I'm so sorry. This is my fault." "Don't," he interrupted, finally looking at me with an expression that was tired rather than angry. "You did what was right. I would have done the same thing, but that doesn't make this any easier for my family." He finished packing his personal items into a cardboard box, the same box he'd used to bring his military medical certificates and family photos when he'd started working here 18 months ago. "Lisa's already looking for work back in Virginia. We can't afford to wait and see if this gets resolved." As Jake walked out of the emergency department for the last time, I realized that Vance's campaign had claimed its first casualty. A good man with a family was losing his job because I'd refused to compromise my integrity for a bully's demands. But Jake wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. Over the next 2 days, I watched my colleagues' behavior change in subtle but unmistakable ways. Teresa started double-checking every interaction with military patients, asking me to review documentation that she'd normally handle independently. Dr. Torres began personally seeing every military patient, regardless of how minor their condition. To avoid any possibility of complaints about care quality, the atmosphere in our department shifted from confident professionalism to anxious hypervigilance. Everyone was walking on eggshells, afraid that any perceived slight or delay in treating military personnel could be the final nail in our program's coffin. Wednesday brought the news I'd been dreading. Dr. Hendricks called me into her office with an expression that told me everything before she said a word. "The preliminary findings from the military review team are not good," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "While they didn't find evidence of overt discrimination, they've identified what they're calling systemic issues with military, cultural competency and priority assessment protocols." I opened the folder and read the devastating summary. The review team had concluded that our staff lacked adequate training in military operational requirements, that our triage system didn't appropriately account for military readiness needs, and that there was evidence of civilian bias in our treatment. Prioritization. They're recommending a probationary period with mandatory military sensitivity training for all staff, Dr. Hendricks continued. "If we agree to their terms, we can keep the contract for 6 months while implementing their required changes. If we don't, the partnership terminates immediately." "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "Preferential scheduling for military personnel, revised documentation procedures to account for operational priority, and mandatory consultation with Base Medical Command for any disputes involving military patients." She paused, looking directly at me. "They're also requiring that all military-related incidents be reviewed by someone with appropriate military experience." The implications were clear. They wanted us to institutionalize the preferential treatment that Vance had demanded. They wanted to create a 2-tiered system where military rank determined medical priority rather than medical need. "Dr. Hendricks, these requirements would compromise our medical ethics and potentially violate federal healthcare regulations." She nodded grimly. "I know. But the hospital board is meeting tonight to decide whether to accept these terms or terminate the military partnership entirely." That evening, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot after my shift, staring at my phone and debating whether to call my old commanding officer for advice. Everything I'd worked to build was crumbling, and I was running out of options to save it. My phone buzzed with a text from Teresa. "Board voted. We're accepting the military's terms. Mandatory staff meeting tomorrow at 6 a.m. to discuss new protocols." I felt something break inside me as I read those words. We were going to compromise everything we stood for to appease when bullies manufactured complaints. We were going to create exactly the kind of discriminatory system that violated the principles both of good medicine and military honor. But the final blow came Thursday morning during the mandatory staff meeting. Dr. Hendricks stood before the assembled emergency department staff, looking like she'd aged 10 years in the past week. "Effective immediately, we'll be implementing new protocols for military patients," she announced. "All active duty personnel will receive priority scheduling, regardless of medical acuity. Military patients will be seen within 30 minutes of arrival unless they're accompanied by someone who can verify that delayed treatment won't impact military readiness." I watched my colleagues' faces as the new policies were explained. Some looked resigned, others confused, and a few appeared genuinely distressed about what we were being asked to do. "Additionally," Dr. Hendricks continued, All incidents involving military personnel must be immediately reported to both hospital administration and base medical command. Any staff member who fails to follow these protocols will face immediate disciplinary action. Teresa raised her hand hesitantly. Dr. Hendricks, what about patients with genuine emergencies? If we're seeing military patients first regardless of medical need, what happens to civilians with serious conditions? We'll manage as best we can, was the unsatisfying answer. The priority is maintaining our military partnership. After the meeting, I found myself standing in the supply closet, trying to process what had just happened. We'd essentially agreed to medical apartheid, one standard of care for military patients and another for everyone else. We'd institutionalized the very discrimination that Vance had falsely accused us of practicing. Dr. Torres found me there 20 minutes later. Riley, I need you to know that I'm putting in my transfer request today. I can't work under these protocols. They violate everything I believe about medical ethics. She wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, 3 more staff members had submitted resignation letters rather than work under the new discriminatory policies. The people who believed in our mission of providing excellent care to everyone were leaving, while those who remained were being forced to compromise their professional integrity to satisfy the demands of one vindictive bully. That Friday afternoon, as I watched another colleague pack up their desk, I realized that Vance had won. He'd successfully destroyed the program I'd helped build, driven away good people, and forced us to implement exactly the kind of preferential treatment system he'd originally demanded. But sitting in the wreckage of everything I'd worked for, I also realized something else. This wasn't just about one incident with one difficult patient anymore. This was about allowing bullies to use institutional power to intimidate good people into abandoning their principles. I was done being intimidated. Staff Sergeant Derek Vance thought he'd destroyed me by forcing us to accept discriminatory protocols and driving away our best staff. What he didn't understand was that he'd just pushed me past the point where I had anything left to lose. When you have nothing left to lose, you become very dangerous to people who've built their power on intimidation and lies. And Vance was about to discover that the little nurse he'd thought he'd defeated was actually just getting started. Saturday morning found me sitting in my kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The weight of the past week felt crushing, watching Jake pack his desk, seeing colleagues compromise their ethics, witnessing the systematic destruction of everything we'd built. But somewhere in the darkness of that moment, a spark of determination began to kindle. I wasn't going to let Derek Vance win through intimidation and lies. My first call was to my former commanding officer, Chief Petty Officer Linda Rodriguez, who'd retired from the Navy and now worked as a civilian contractor specializing in military medical ethics. If anyone would understand both the medical and military implications of what had happened, it would be her. Riley, Linda's voice was warm but concerned when she answered. I heard through the grapevine that you're having some challenges at your hospital. Want to talk about it? I spent an hour walking Linda through everything that had happened, from Vance's initial demands to falsify records, through the systematic campaign that had resulted in discriminatory protocols being implemented at our hospital. Jesus, Riley, Linda said when I finished. This isn't just about one bad Marine. What you're describing sounds like a pattern of behavior. Has anyone looked into this guy's background? What do you mean? I mean that the tactics you're describing, the systematic complaints, the media manipulation, the pressure campaign, those aren't improvised. That's someone who's done this before and knows exactly how to work the system. Linda's words sparked something in my mind. You think this isn't his first time pulling something like this? I'd bet money on it. Riley, I still have contacts in personnel command. Give me his full name and unit, and let me make some quiet inquiries. If this guy has a history of this kind of behavior, we need to know about it. After giving Linda all the information I had about Vance, I started making my own calls. My second contact was Captain Sarah Mitchell, a former Navy JAG officer who now specialized in healthcare law and military contracting ethics. "Riley, what you're describing sounds like potential fraud and abuse of government contracting processes," Sarah said after I explained the situation. "If this Marine used false allegations to manipulate military contracting decisions, that's a federal offense. But how do we prove that his allegations were false? Documentation, timeline reconstruction, witness statements. Most importantly, we need to show a pattern of behavior that demonstrates intent to defraud rather than legitimate complaints." Sarah walked me through the legal framework surrounding military contracting and civilian healthcare partnerships. The key is proving that his complaints were made in bad faith with the intent to manipulate contract decisions for personal reasons rather than legitimate concerns about medical care. My third call was to Dr. Marcus Webb, a former Army trauma surgeon who now worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs, investigating healthcare fraud and abuse. Marcus had been a mentor during my early nursing career, and I trusted his judgment on complex medical ethics issues. "Riley, what you're describing isn't just unethical, it's dangerous," Marcus said bluntly. "Creating preferential treatment systems based on military rank rather than medical need puts patients at risk, both military and civilian patients. The hospital board thinks they're protecting the military contract. They're opening themselves up to massive liability. If a civilian patient suffers because they were delayed for non-emergency military treatment, the lawsuits will destroy them. And if military personnel receive inappropriate priority treatment that masks serious medical conditions, the liability is even worse." Marcus agreed to help me document the medical ethics violations inherent in the new protocols. "I'll put together a formal analysis of why these policies violate federal healthcare standards. That should give you ammunition for pushing back." By Sunday afternoon, I had assembled a small but powerful team of experts who understood both the military and medical implications of what Vance had orchestrated. But I needed more than expert opinions. I needed evidence. That's when I remembered the hospital security system. Monday morning, I approached Kevin Chun, our IT security manager, with a carefully worded request. "Kevin, I need to review security footage from last Tuesday's incident with the military patient. Dr. Hendricks asked me to prepare a comprehensive report for the administrative review." This wasn't entirely false. Dr. Hendricks had mentioned wanting a detailed incident report. Though she hadn't specifically requested security footage, Kevin pulled up the recordings from multiple camera angles, covering the triage area and waiting room. "Riley, you know this will show the entire interaction, right? Audio and video? That's exactly what I need." As I watched the footage, I realized that Vance had made a crucial error. His entire intimidation campaign was based on the assumption that it was his word against mine, a staff sergeant's allegations against a civilian nurse's denials. What he hadn't counted on was that every word of our conversation had been recorded by the hospital security system. The audio clearly captured his demands for preferential treatment, his request that I falsify medical documentation, and his explicit threats about destroying our military contract if I didn't comply. Even more damaging was the footage of him making phone calls to military command while still in our waiting room, before he'd even received medical treatment. "Kevin, I need copies of this footage for administrative review. Can you provide them on encrypted drives with timestamps and authentication?" "Absolutely." "Do you want me to include the recordings of his phone calls in the waiting room?" I hadn't realized the security system had captured those conversations. "Yes, everything." Tuesday brought the first piece of intelligence from Linda Rodriguez. "Riley, you were right to be suspicious. I can't give you details, but Derek Vance has been counseled multiple times for inappropriate interactions with civilian contractors. There have been at least 3 formal complaints filed against him in the past 2 years." "What kind of complaints?" "Pattern of behavior involving intimidation of civilian personnel, abuse of rank and position, and inappropriate demands for preferential treatment. He was actually transferred to Camp Harrison after an incident at his previous assignment. The pieces were starting to come together. Vance wasn't just a difficult patient. He was a predator who systematically targeted civilian institutions that depended on military contracts. Linda, can you connect me with the people who filed those previous complaints? I can try, but Riley, you need to be careful. If Vance finds out you're investigating him, he could escalate his campaign against you and your hospital. That evening, I received a detailed legal analysis from Sarah Mitchell outlining the federal statutes that Vance's behavior potentially violated. The document was comprehensive and damning, showing how his tactics constituted fraud, abuse of government contracting processes, and potentially criminal intimidation. Dr. Marcus Webb's medical ethics analysis was equally powerful, demonstrating how the discriminatory protocols we'd been forced to implement violated federal healthcare standards and put patients at risk. Wednesday morning, I sat in my apartment with 3 folders spread across my kitchen table: security footage documenting Vance's actual behavior, legal analysis showing potential federal crimes, and medical ethics documentation proving the protocols were dangerous and illegal. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had weapons that could match Vance's tactics. But I also knew that what came next would be the most dangerous part of this entire ordeal. I was about to transition from defense to offense, from victim to prosecutor. I was going to take everything I'd learned and use it to expose not just what Vance had done to us, but what he'd probably done to other civilian institutions that depended on military partnerships. But first, I had one more call to make to someone who had the authority and jurisdiction to investigate federal crimes involving military personnel and government contracting fraud. Staff Sergeant Derek Vance had spent weeks systematically destroying everything I'd worked to build, confident that his rank and institutional power made him untouchable. He was about to learn that some battles can't be won through intimidation, and that the little nurse he'd thought he'd defeated had just finished preparing a counterattack that would end his career permanently. Thursday morning, I placed the most important phone call of my career. After researching federal oversight agencies, I'd identified the Defense Criminal Investigative Service as the appropriate authority for investigating fraud involving military personnel and government contracts. Special Agent Jennifer Walsh answered. On the second ring, DCIS, Agent Walsh speaking. Agent Walsh, my name is Riley Cameron. I'm a registered nurse and former Navy corpsman, calling to report what I believe is systematic fraud involving military contracting and abuse of government resources by active duty personnel. There was a pause. Ms. Cameron, those are serious allegations. Can you provide me with some specifics? I spent the next 45 minutes walking Agent Walsh through everything: Vance's demands for falsified documentation, his systematic intimidation campaign, the manipulation of military contracting processes, and the evidence I'd gathered, showing this was part of a pattern of behavior. Ms. Cameron, do you have documentation supporting these allegations? Yes, ma'am. Security footage with audio of the entire incident, recorded phone calls he made while in our facility, legal analysis of the federal statutes violated, and evidence of similar complaints at his previous assignments. Agent Walsh's tone became more focused. I'm going to transfer you to Special Agent David Kim, who specializes in military contracting fraud. He'll want to schedule an in-person interview and review all your documentation. Friday afternoon, Special Agent Kim arrived at my apartment with another DCIS investigator, Agent Martinez. They were professional but thorough, spending 3 hours reviewing every piece of evidence I'd compiled. Miss Cameron, Agent Kim said as he examined the security footage, this is extremely valuable evidence. The audio clearly shows Staff Sergeant Vance demanding preferential treatment and threatening to manipulate contracting processes if his demands weren't met. Agent Martinez was reviewing the documentation from Linda Rodriguez about Vance's history. This pattern of behavior across multiple assignments suggests systematic abuse of his position. Have you been in contact with previous victims? Not yet. My contact at Personnel Command is working on connecting me with people who filed complaints against him. Don't do that, Agent Kim said firmly. Now that this is an active DCIS investigation, we need to handle all witness contacts. We don't want to compromise potential testimony or give Vance's defense team grounds to claim witness tampering. The agents explained that they would be launching a comprehensive investigation into Vance's conduct across all his assignments, examining whether his behavior constituted federal crimes including fraud, extortion, and abuse of government contracting processes. What happens to our hospital situation while this investigation is ongoing? I asked. That's complicated, Agent Martinez replied. We can't interfere with existing military contracts while the investigation is pending. But we can provide preliminary findings to appropriate commands if we find evidence of misconduct that affected current contract decisions. Monday brought the first breakthrough. Agent Walsh called with news that would change everything. Ms. Cameron, we've completed our preliminary review of Staff Sergeant Vance's history. You were right about this being a pattern. We've identified at least 6 civilian institutions across 3 different assignments where Vance filed similar complaints resulting in contract modifications or terminations. My heart raced. 6 different places? A private medical practice in Georgia that lost their military family contract after Vance complained about discriminatory treatment. A civilian physical therapy clinic in Texas that was forced to implement preferential scheduling for military patients. A diagnostic imaging center in Virginia that was investigated for anti-military bias after refusing to prioritize Vance's routine appointment. Agent Walsh continued, in every case, the pattern is identical. Vance demands preferential treatment or special consideration, makes explicit threats about contract consequences when refused, then files formal complaints alleging discrimination and unprofessional conduct. Have any of these other institutions fought back? That's the most disturbing part. Most of them simply accepted the demands rather than risk losing their military contracts. The few that tried to fight were eventually forced to either comply or lose their partnerships entirely. I felt sick thinking about all the civilian healthcare providers who'd been bullied into compromising their ethics by one predatory Marine who'd learned to weaponize the military contracting system. But here's the good news, Agent Walsh added. Your documentation is by far the most comprehensive we've seen. The security footage showing his explicit threats and demands for falsified records provides evidence we've never had before. Tuesday brought another call, this time from Linda Rodriguez. Riley, I've been cleared to share some additional information with DCIS. Vance's behavior has been a concern at higher levels for months. There's been an ongoing investigation into irregularities in his recommendations for civilian contractor evaluations. What kind of irregularities? Patterns of negative evaluations for contractors who refuse to provide him with special consideration, and positive evaluations for those who complied with his demands. The Marine Corps has been building a case for administrative action, but they needed stronger evidence of criminal behavior. The pieces were falling into place. Vance hadn't just been bullying individual civilians. He'd been systematically corrupting the military contracting process for personal gain and ego gratification. Wednesday brought the most shocking revelation of all. Agent Kim called with news from their forensic analysis of Vance's communications. Ms. Cameron, we obtained warrants for Vance's phone and email records. What we found is extraordinary. He's been coordinating with other military personnel to identify civilian contractors who might be vulnerable to this kind of pressure. I was stunned. You mean this isn't just one rogue Marine? We're still investigating, but it appears there's A network of military personnel who share information about civilian contractors they consider uncooperative or disrespectful to military culture. They coordinate complaint strategies and share tactics for maximum pressure. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just individual misconduct, it was an organized effort to intimidate civilian contractors into providing preferential treatment through systematic abuse of the military complaint system. Agent Kim. How widespread is this? We're still determining the scope, but preliminary evidence suggests dozens of civilian healthcare providers, contractors, and service businesses have been targeted. The economic impact could be in the millions of dollars when you factor in lost contracts, forced policy changes, and compromised services. Thursday brought the moment I'd been waiting for. Dr. Hendricks called me into her office with an expression I couldn't read. "Riley, I just got off the phone with Colonel Mills from Camp Harrison. She asked me to inform you that Staff Sergeant Vance has been placed on administrative leave pending a federal investigation. She also wanted me to tell you that the military review of our protocols has been suspended." I felt a surge of vindication, but Dr. Hendricks wasn't finished. There's more. The military command has requested a new review of the incident, this time focusing on whether Staff Sergeant Vance's complaints were made in good faith. They're particularly interested in security footage from the day of the incident. "Dr. Hendricks, I need to tell you something. I've been working with federal investigators on this case. The security footage has already been provided to DCIS. As evidence in their investigation." Her eyes widened. "Riley, why didn't you tell me you were conducting your own investigation?" "Because I needed to protect the hospital and our staff from further retaliation. If Vance had known we were investigating him, he could have escalated his campaign or destroyed evidence." Friday afternoon, Agent Walsh called with the news that would vindicate everything I'd endured over the past month. "Ms. Cameron, based on our investigation, DCIS is recommending that the Department of Defense Inspector General launch a comprehensive review of military contracting processes and civilian contractor complaint procedures. Your case has exposed systematic abuse that goes far beyond one individual." She paused, and I could hear papers rustling. "More immediately, we have enough evidence to recommend criminal charges against Staff Sergeant Vance for fraud, extortion, and abuse of government contracting processes. His military chain of command has been informed that he'll be facing both criminal prosecution and court-martial proceedings." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the nightmare that had started with one bully's demands had uncovered a massive conspiracy that had been victimizing civilian contractors across the country. Staff Sergeant Derek Vance had thought he was intimidating a little nurse who wouldn't fight back. Instead, he'd picked a target who had the training, determination, and integrity to expose not just his individual crimes, but an entire network of military personnel who'd been systematically corrupting the contracting process. The truth was finally coming to light, and it was far more damaging to Vance and his co-conspirators than they could have ever imagined. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room at Camp Harrison's headquarters, watching as Brigadier General Rebecca Thompson delivered what she called long overdue justice to a packed room of military officials, civilian contractors, and media representatives. "The investigation initiated by Ms. Riley Cameron's complaint has resulted in the most significant military contracting fraud case our command has seen in over a decade," General Thompson announced. What began as a single incident at Riverside Medical Center uncovered a systematic conspiracy involving multiple military personnel across several installations. The results of the federal investigation had exceeded everyone's expectations. Staff Sergeant Derek Vance was facing federal charges for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy, with additional court-martial proceedings for conduct unbecoming and abuse of his position. But he wasn't alone in the defendant's dock. The investigation identified a network of 11 military personnel who had systematically abused the civilian contractor complaint system. General Thompson continued. These individuals coordinated their efforts to intimidate civilian businesses into providing preferential treatment through false allegations and manufactured complaints. I glanced around the room, seeing faces I recognized from the past months of investigation and legal proceedings. Agent Walsh sat in the front row, having become something of a hero within DCI as for exposing the conspiracy. Dr. Hendricks was there representing our hospital, which had become a model for how civilian institutions should respond to intimidation. Tactics. The economic impact of this conspiracy exceeded $4.2 million in fraudulently influenced contract decisions, forced policy changes, and business losses across 17 civilian institutions, the general stated. More seriously, these actions compromised the integrity of our military contracting processes and damaged relationships with civilian partners who serve our military families. The personal vindication was profound, but what mattered more was the systematic change that had resulted from our fight. The Department of Defense had implemented new oversight procedures for civilian contractor complaints, mandatory ethics training for all personnel involved in contracting decisions, and independent review processes to prevent future abuse. Ms. Cameron, General Thompson said, turning toward me, your courage in refusing to compromise your professional integrity, despite significant pressure and potential personal cost, exemplifies the values we strive to uphold in military service. Your actions not only protected the integrity of civilian healthcare, but also helped preserve the honor of our military contracting system. She handed me a formal commendation from the Department of Defense Inspector General, recognizing my role in exposing the fraud conspiracy. But the real recognition had come weeks earlier when Riverside Medical Center's military partnership was not only renewed but expanded, with our hospital designated as a regional center of excellence for military-civilian healthcare cooperation. The personal costs of the fight had been significant. I'd spent months under investigation, faced professional scrutiny, and watched colleagues lose their jobs because of the initial fallout. But those costs paled in comparison to what would have happened if I'd compromised my integrity and allowed Vance's intimidation to succeed. Jake Morrison had been the first person I called when the DCIS investigation vindicated our actions. He'd taken a position with the VA hospital in Richmond, but when our military contract was renewed and expanded, I was able to offer him his old job back with a promotion to assistant head nurse and a salary increase that reflected his value to our program. I never doubted you were doing the right thing, Jake told me when he returned to Riverside. But I'll admit there were some dark moments when I wondered if doing the right thing was going to be enough. Dr. Amanda Torres had also returned, drawn back by the opportunity to work in what was now recognized as one of the most ethically managed military-civilian medical partnerships in the country. The discriminatory protocols that had been forced on us were not only rescinded, but replaced with enhanced training programs that emphasized equal treatment and medical ethics. What you accomplished here has changed how military contracting works. Nationwide, Dr. Torres said during our first staff meeting after the full team was reassembled. Every civilian contractor now has legal protections and clear procedures for reporting intimidation or abuse. The legal proceedings against Vance and his co-conspirators had been swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including the security footage that captured his explicit threats and demands for falsified records, Vance had accepted a plea agreement that included federal prison time, dishonorable discharge, and restitution payments to the civilian institutions he'd victimized. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when Colonel Patricia Mills, the same officer who had initially reviewed Vance's complaints against us, called to personally apologize and request a meeting about expanding our partnership. Ms. Cameron, I want you to know that the military command was deceived by Staff Sergeant Vance's allegations, Colonel Mills said during her visit to our hospital. The investigation revealed that he had manipulated information and fabricated evidence to support his complaints. Your professionalism throughout this ordeal, even when facing significant pressure, demonstrates the kind of integrity we value in our civilian partners. The colonel explained that our case had become a training example within military contracting education, showing how civilian institutions should respond to inappropriate pressure and how military personnel should recognize and report abuse of the complaint system. We're implementing new protocols based on what we learned from this case, she continued. Every complaint against civilian contractors will now be independently reviewed, with mandatory investigation of any patterns of complaints from individual military personnel. The media coverage had been extensive, but I'd chosen to keep a low profile throughout the legal proceedings. The story had been covered as a victory for whistleblower protection and civilian contractor rights, but I preferred to let the systematic changes speak for themselves rather than seeking personal recognition. However, I did agree to speak at a national conference on military-civilian healthcare partnerships, where my presentation on maintaining professional integrity under pressure became one of the most requested sessions. The most important lesson from this experience, I told the audience of healthcare professionals and military officials, is that compromising your integrity to avoid short-term consequences inevitably leads to worse long-term outcomes. The standards that govern our professions exist for good reasons, and they're worth defending even when that defense comes at personal cost. A year after the initial incident, I received an unexpected visitor at the hospital. Master Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, who had taken over Vance's former position at Camp Harrison, came to thank me personally for exposing the corruption that had damaged relationships between the base and civilian community. You probably don't realize this, Master Sergeant Rodriguez said, but Vance's behavior had created a toxic environment that was affecting multiple civilian partnerships. Restaurant owners, contractors, medical providers, everyone was walking on eggshells, afraid that any perceived slight would result in complaints that could destroy their businesses. She explained how the base command had worked to rebuild trust with the civilian community, implementing new training programs and establishing clear protocols for appropriate military-civilian interactions. What you didn't just save your hospital, she continued. You saved the relationship between Camp Harrison and the entire Cedar Falls community. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that the moment when Staff Sergeant Vance walked into our emergency department and tried to intimidate me into compromising my integrity had been a test, not just of my personal principles, but of whether our systems were strong enough to protect good people from predators who abuse institutional power. The fact that I'd been able to fight back successfully, expose the conspiracy, and create lasting change proved that integrity and determination could triumph over intimidation and corruption. But it had taken everything I'd learned in both my military and civilian careers, strategic thinking, documentation, building alliances, and the courage to stand firm when everything was at stake. Staff Sergeant Derek Vance had thought he was dealing with a little nurse who could be easily intimidated into abandoning her principles. Instead, he'd encountered someone with the training, experience, and moral courage to expose not just his individual crimes, but an entire network of military personnel who had forgotten that true strength comes from protecting others, not exploiting them. Sometimes the most powerful victories come not from backing down when threatened, but from standing firm when everything you've built is on the line. And sometimes, protecting your integrity isn't just about doing what's right. It's about ensuring that others won't have to face the same bullies who tried to break you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.